Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group. I'm Carl Estabrook. Aware was formed after the attacks of 9/11-2001 by citizens of Champaign-Urbana who saw that the U.S. government would use those crimes as an excuse to carry on its wars in the Middle East. Some people even think that the U.S. government staged the crimes of 9/11 to give it an excuse to attack the world's greatest oil-producing region, the Middle East. But unfortunately, the U.S. government didn't need an excuse. It had already been killing people in the Mideast for 2 generations to secure control of those energy resources. The 9/11 attacks were in fact a counterattack, as the perpetrators said, for U.S. military action in the Middle East, notably the sanctions against Iraq that killed 500,000 children. The Clinton administration said it was worth it, and for Israeli oppression of the Palestinians. The Obama administration, which promised hope and change, simply continued the murderous policies of earlier administrations and simply lies about what it's doing. Obama calls it leading from behind. Today we see the murderous U.S. policy being carried on in 2 vicious wars by American client states, Ukraine and Israel. Israel has massacred more than 1,000 people in Gaza, mostly civilians, and the U.S.-backed and installed government in Kiev has killed over 1,000 in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass region. And its war has resulted in the destruction of a commercial airliner that killed 298 men, women, and children. Who's responsible for mass murder in Gaza and Donbass? Their leaders can be blamed for Israel and Ukraine's committing what the Nuremberg Tribunal called the supreme international crime, launching aggressive war. But the final responsibility lies with the President of the United States. Without the support, economic, military, political, and diplomatic, that the U.S. government provides, Israel's crimes would not be possible, and neither would the coup and military assaults by the Ukrainian government. But the U.S. provides this support because it's the policy of that government, whatever the administration is, to enforce by military means the control over the world economy that the American 1% has enjoyed since the Second World War. In the Mideast, since then, the U.S. has been killing people to secure control of what the U.S. State Department then called the world's greatest material prize, Mideast gas and oil. The U.S. government demands not just access to Mideast energy resources, but control of them, because a stranglehold over world energy flows gives the U.S. the advantage over its economic rivals in Europe and Asia, notably Germany and China. President Obama fails to stop Israel's ongoing murders in Gaza, as he could with a word, because it's been the policy of all U.S. administrations for 2 generations to allow the Israelis to continue their oppression of the Palestinians, so long as Israel supports and participates in the crimes of its U.S. master. In Eastern Europe, the U.S. immediately violated its promise to Russia not to extend NATO's to the Russian borders, and are now scheming to do so through Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. President Obama's administration engineered the coup against an elected government in Ukraine and sent the CIA chief to encourage a Ukrainian army attack on the regions that resisted the new Ukrainian government, the first government since World War II in Europe to include fascist parties. Washington uses 1,000 military bases around the world, and its special forces active in 124 countries. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. They use this to control the world economy in the interests of the 1%. That control is not in the interests of the vast majority of Americans who pay for it. And although Americans don't know it, Obama has killed thousands of people with drone strikes alone, including hundreds of children. No other country, not Russia or China, has foreign bases or conducts similar killings. No wonder the U.S. is hated around the world. But Obama's main task is to cover over the wars he's sponsoring. 3/4 of Americans disapprove of the wars of the Bush-Obama years, and the billions of dollars spent on them could have been used here at home. Obama was elected to end the wars and provide jobs. He has done neither, and Americans' anger is growing. His job is to turn aside that anger. One way that's done is to use a compliant media to misrepresent the Obama administration's military and economic policy. Our task here at Aware on the Air, like similar independent programs around the country, is to combat that overwhelming propaganda. We'll try to do that tonight with reports and comments from David Green on the situation in Gaza, Ron Zoke on remembering the future, Yaakov Ziso with comments, Karen Evans-Levy on local anti-war actions, and Pat Buchanan on the Republicans and Obama's war. And we'll begin with Ron Zoke with remembering the future, right?
Yes, I'm alluding to the suggestion that it's time to remember what people used to think about the future of Zionism and the State of Israel. And as I did too during the pre-statehood wars days, and through some of the wars that followed and the disillusionment that has followed since then. So people still have nostalgia about those early days when brave little Israel was taking in the Jews and standing up for the rights of Jews all around the world, and the horror show that this has turned into under some right-wing governments in Israel, and increasing the alienation of many American Jews from the State of Israel and from Zionism generally. So there's a symptom of this in today's article in the New York Times by Roger Cohen, Zionism and Its Discontents. He says, if there are more than 1,000 Palestinian deaths, including 200 children, and more than 50 Israeli deaths, Israel argues, it is the fault of Hamas, for whom Palestinian victims are the most powerful anti-Israeli argument in the court of world opinion. I am a Zionist, he says, because the story of my forebears convinces me that the Jews needed a homeland voted into existence by the United Nations Resolution 181 in 1947, calling for the establishment of two states, one Jewish, one Arab, in Mandate Palestine. I am a Zionist who believes that the words of Israel's founding charter of 1948 declaring that the nascent state of Israel would be based on freedom, justice, and peace as envisaged by the prophets of Israel. What I cannot accept, however, is the perversion of Zionism that has seen the inexorable growth of a messianic Israeli nationalism claiming all the land between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, that has, for almost a half century now, produced the systematic oppression of another people in the West Bank that has led to the steady expansion of Israeli settlements on the very West Bank land of any Palestinian state, that isolates moderate Palestinians like Salam Fayyad in the name of divide and rule, that pursues policies that will make it impossible to remain a Jewish and democratic state, that seeks tactical advantage rather than the strategic breakthrough in a two-state peace, that blockades Gaza with 1.8 million people locked in its prison, and then is surprised by the periodic eruptions of the inmates, and that responds disproportionately to attack in a way that kills hundreds of children. As a Zionist, I cannot accept this, he says. Jews, above all people, know what oppression is, and he goes on in this vein. Not sure about Zionism at this point, in view of what it has led to. Could it have been foreseen? And the bitter, murderous, destructive result in the present state of Israel. There was interesting anticipation of this, by the way, by Hannah Arendt, going back to the late 1940s, in a piece written 2.5 years ago by Philip Weiss of Mondo Weiss. She wrote that what Israel would inevitably turn into was something like what it has become, what she calls a Sparta, that is a warrior state. Nationalism, she wrote, is bad enough when it trusts in nothing but the rude force of the nation. A nationalism that necessarily and admittedly depends on the force of a foreign nation is certainly worse. This is the threatened state of Jewish nationalism and the proposed Jewish state, surrounded inevitably by Arab states and Arab people. Even a Jewish majority in Palestine, nay, even a transfer of all Palestine's Arabs, that is, out of Palestine, expelling them, which is openly demanded by the revisionists, would not substantially change a situation in which Jews must either ask protection from an outside power against their neighbors or come to a working agreement with their neighbors. So Israel has gone the other way, that is not seeking an accommodation with their neighbors, but constantly defying them and depending on the USA to supply it with the money and the firepower to maintain this stance. All the while, of course, blaming the victim of their aggressions as they take more land, destroy more Palestinian homes, and kill more Palestinians, including now, most significantly, those penned up in the Gaza Strip, which several have now called the world's largest open-air prison, and then pretending to be offended and upset and surprised when the inmates occasionally try to break out and when they try to defend themselves with the poor, meager means at their disposal. So we constantly hear that Israel has a right to defend itself, but alas, we never hear whether Gaza has a right to defend itself and what the consequences of that might be. She goes on, the Zionists, if they continue to ignore the Mediterranean people and watch out only for the big faraway powers, will appear only as their tools, the agents of a foreign and hostile interests. Jews who know their own history should be aware that such a state of affairs will inevitably lead to a new wave of Jew hatred. The anti-Semitism of tomorrow will assert that Jews not only profiteered from the presence of big foreign powers in that region, but actually plotted it and hence are guilty of the consequence. And so on. I recommend this piece to you, and it, I think, should give some people to think. David Grossman, an Israeli intellectual, in a translated piece in the New York Times, wrote this, which I alluded to in my title. He said, here in Israel, as soon as the war is over, we must begin the process of creating a new partnership, an internal alliance that will alter the array of narrow interest groups that controls us. An alliance of those who comprehend the fatal risk of continuing to circle the grindstone, those who understand that our border lines no longer separate Jews from Arabs, but people who long to live in peace from those who feed ideologically and emotionally on continued violence. I believe that Israel still contains a critical mass of people, both left-wing and right-wing, religious and secular, Jews and Arabs, who are capable of uniting with sobriety, with no illusions, around a few points of agreement to resolve the conflict with our neighbors. There are many who still remember the future, an odd phrase, but an accurate one in this context, the future that they want for Israel and for Palestine. There are still, but who knows how much longer, people in Israel who still understand that if we sink into apathy again, we will be leaving the arena to those who would drag us fervently into the next war, in igniting the very possible locus of conflict in every possible locus of conflict in Israeli society as they go. If we do not do this, we will all, Israelis and Palestinians, blindfolded, our heads bowed in stupor, collaborating with hopelessness, continue to turn the grindstone of this conflict, which crushes and erodes our lives, our hopes, and our humanity. David Grossman is the author, most recently, of Falling Out of Time and several other books. Added note, pro-Palestinian human rights group B'Tselem is lodging an appeal to the top Israeli court after its paid-for announcement, which was simply a list of the killed Palestinian youths, was rejected by Israeli media regulator as being too political. IBA, the Israeli Broadcasting Authority, says broadcasting the children's names is politically controversial. By refusing to do so is itself a far-reaching statement. It says the huge price being paid by civilians in Gaza, many of them children, must be censored, said a statement from this group. Is it controversial that these children aren't alive, that they're children, that those are their names? These are facts that we wish to bring to the public's knowledge. More than 150 Palestinian children have been killed over the past week as the IDF ramped up its Operation Protective Edge, intended to nullify Hamas's ability to launch rockets into Israeli territory. And this is going on, of course, while Israel continues to launch rockets at Gaza from the warplanes supplied by the USA, the fighter bombers and helicopter gunships, and so on. And continuing trying to use Israeli civilians as shields, claiming that these rockets are horrible, a menace because they are killing or might kill or might injure innocent Israeli civilians. So same thing, but just in the opposite sense. So there are other things that I may return to later. Headlines: U.S. fuming over Israeli criticism of Kerry. Really brutal and stupid criticism. With Israel at war, U.S. lawmakers give full support. Unanimous resolution in Congress, which in other contexts we hear cannot be achieved without a great deal of coercion. And finally, well, some items locally that I may return to later if the situation seems to require it. That's all for now.
Thank you, Ron. You're listening to and watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group. Our focus is on the actions of the American government and its responsibility for the horrific wars going on in several parts of the world. This from a president who was elected under a rubric of hope and change, and clearly on the part of the American electorate in opposition to the wars established by the previous administration. Strange things have happened in American domestic politics in regard to that war, and to regard to those wars. And one of the most striking is pointed out by a column this week from Patrick Buchanan. Buchanan was an official in the Reagan administration, actually ran for president, was a candidate for president for the Republicans on 2 occasions, and has been for years a commentator and writer on American politics and American society. He has a column this week that talks about what's going on in the Republican Party, or to put it more accurately, within the War Party. It's been pointed out there really aren't 2 parties in American politics at all, the Republicans and Democrats, and haven't been for a long time. There are 2 wings of the Property Party, as Gore Vidal said, or 2 factions within the parties that represent the neoliberal party that represents the American 1%. But there also is a unity in the 2 parties in regard to America's wars. This last week, the Senate voted 100-0, i.e. unanimously, to back Israel's massacre in Gaza. That's quite remarkable, as Ron pointed out. We have not got unanimous votes on much else from the Senate recently. There was not even a unanimous vote in terms of attacking Iraq in 2003. So the agreement says something about what's going on within the parties, and that's Patrick Buchanan's concern, the emergence of the War Party as the dominant group in American politics. He says the attempts right now to unite the Republican Party, usually around discussions of a candidate for president in 2016. The attempts to unite the Republican Party is remarkably less united on this issue perhaps than the Democrats are. Buchanan says the odds are now at least even that the Republicans will not only hold the House of Representatives, maintain their majority in the House of Representatives after the fall election, but also capture the Senate. A Republican majority in both House and Senate looks like being the result of the November election. But, writes Buchanan, before traditional conservatives share that prospect, they might take a closer look at the foreign policy that a Republican Senate, They might take a closer look at the foreign policy that a Republican Senate would seek to impose on the nation. Specifically, they should spend time reading Senate 2277, that's the way legislation in the Senate is indicated, the Russian Aggression Prevention Act of 2014, introduced by Republican Senator Bob Corker on May 1st and endorsed by half of the Senate's GOP caucus. As ranking Republican on the Foreign Affairs Committee, Corker is, and my English friends would find the name appropriate, Corker is in line to become chairman should the GOP take the Senate. That makes the proposal a gravely serious matter. Corker's bill would declare Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine, quote, major non-NATO allies of the United States, move NATO forces into Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, accelerate the building of an ABM, an anti-ballistic missile, system in Eastern Europe, and authorize U.S. intelligence and military aid for Ukraine's army in the Donbass war with Russian-backed separatists. Buchanan calls them separatists. We can argue about whether they're really separatists, but what he's talking about here is the separatists in the Republican Party, if you like. U.S. aid would include anti-tank and anti-aircraft weapons. S-2277 would direct the Secretary of State to intensify efforts to strengthen democratic institutions within the Russian Federation. Interesting way to put it. That is, it means to subvert Vladimir Putin's government looking towards regime change. If Putin has not vacated Crimea and terminated support for Ukraine's separatist rebels within 7 days of passage of the Corker ultimatum, sweeping sanctions would be imposed on Russian officials, banks, and energy companies, including Gazprom, the international energy corporation that supplies a good bit of Europe's gas. Economic relations between us would be virtually severed. In short, this is an ultimatum to Russia that she faces a new Cold War if she does not get out of Ukraine and Crimea, and it is a U.S. declaration that we will now regard 3 more former Soviet republics, Moldova, Ukraine, and Georgia, as allies. A small, weak country might accept this dictation from a superpower. But Russia, where anti-Americanism is virulent and rampant, and the Russian people support Putin's action in Ukraine, would want him to tell the Americans just what to do with their ultimatum. And how Russia would respond is not difficult to predict. Our demand that she get out of Crimea and leave her 2-century-old naval base at Sevastopol in the custody of President Petro Poroshenko, Pepe Escobar calls him Chocolate-shenko because he made his money. He's an oligarch who made his money in the chocolate business. That would be laughed off. Putin would tell us that Crimea has voted to return to Russia. It's ours and we're going to keep it. Now deal with it. To make good on the latest red line, we would have to start shipping weapons to Kiev, in which case Russia, with superior forces closer, would likely move preemptively into East Ukraine. This is Pat Buchanan's projection, but it's not necessarily false. And it certainly is true that the U.S. has been supporting the Kiev government up to and including with weapons already. What would our NATO allies do then? The U.S. directive to the State Department to work with NGOs in Russia, blatant intervention in the internal affairs of a sovereign state, would be answered with a general expulsion of these agencies from Moscow. We would not sit still for this kind of open subversion in the United States. What makes us think that they would? And where do we come off telling the Russians what kind of government they may have? Do we do that with our friends in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait? Is there more freedom in Egypt, to which we send billions annually in foreign aid, than in Russia? Is there more freedom in China? How do we think Beijing would respond if Corker and Company openly declared not only their right, but their intent to funnel U.S. funds to civic organizations to bring about an end to single-party communist rule? The Russian people, today backing Putin by 80%, seem happier with their government than we Americans do with ours. But it may be this idea of installing a ballistic missile defense, an ABM system in Poland and the Czech Republic, that is most dangerous of all. Putin has already signaled that this would cross his red line, that if we start implanting anti-missile missiles in Eastern Europe, he will reply by installing offensive missiles. The Reagan-Gorbachev INF Treaty, to eliminate all intermediate-range nuclear missiles from Europe, the USSR's triple warhead SS-20s and our Pershing II and cruise missiles would wind up in the dumpster. We could have a mini Cuban Missile Crisis in Eastern Europe. And since, by the way, Pat Buchanan wrote this article, the U.S. government has raised the possibility, very strangely, that Russia violated that Reagan-Gorbachev INF treaty in 2008. We might ask ourselves why the American government should now, this summer, bring that issue up if they are not thinking along the lines that Buchanan suggests here. How would our German allies react to Russian missiles rising in Kaliningrad, the former Prussian capital of Königsberg, wedged between Lithuania and Poland? Russia and Ukraine have been like Siamese twins for 1,000 years. When did and where and how, when did they and how did they become separate? Where and how they become separate, when did that become our strategic concern? Under Obama, the U.S. has declined to intervene in civil wars in Syria, Ukraine, and Libya, or to go back and force in Iraq. He is pulling us out of Afghanistan. Now, I think that's actually false, that Buchanan's notion there is incorrect. He is raising the Obama administration's official stance on these matters to contrast it with this aggressive approach to Russia that we have been hearing not just from Republicans, but indeed from the Obama administration. Buchanan concludes, the American imperium is folding up, retrenchment is underway. If the Republican counteroffer to Obama's is a return to the compulsive interventionism of Bush II, this is where some of us will be getting off. Well, we might discuss that in various ways. It's not at all clear the American imperium is folding up. In fact, it seems to be extremely active on the military front in maintaining that sort of European or that sort of worldwide economic hegemony that it's enjoyed since the Second World War. And it's exactly the willingness of the other party to throw in with what the Obama administration is doing, even when it says it's not, that Buchanan is rightly calling to task here. These are serious issues. They do not follow the normal lines, you might say, of American politics, but they are issues literally of life and death, and of what the American government is doing in the massacres that are going on around the world, sponsored by the U.S. And for which the U.S. is responsible. You're listening to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of the anti-war, anti-racism Effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group. Yaakov.
Is it on?
Yeah. Yes, it's on.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm here to essentially represent Israeli people as opposed to what was called here the Jewish or the Zionist people. There's a very distinct difference between Israelis and Zionists, and I think that the whole diversity of the people involved in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and atrocities is not represented in these discussions. And I'm sorry about that, because I think that the people on this panel and also friends in AWARE are quite capable and also mostly willing to do something in order to achieve some quiet and peace for the Palestinian people and for the Israeli people. I think that there are repercussions to the brutality of language, such as my friend Ran used, calling Israelis or describing the Israelis and what they've done in the past 3 weeks, in the past years and months, and it goes on for decades. The repercussions are that the Israeli people, and I speak and read the articles of left and center every day, the Israeli people are hearing hatred, are hearing this brutality, something that makes them feel even more cornered, as in there is nothing else they can do other than keep shooting and attacking those people in Gaza and in the West Bank. The Palestinian people, when they see all this hot air that is being generated in the United States, and they see that nothing in their conditions has changed, not in the past 3 weeks, not in the past years, not since the Oslo Agreement, not even since 1948 or 67. Their lives is miserable and getting just more and more miserable. So, on one hand, I'm sure that the people in Urbana, in AWARE, would like to do something to help those Palestinians and Israelis. And on the other hand, one has to recognize nothing has changed or helped so far. So maybe this is time to address what David Grossman said in that very same article. He says, why don't we just start thinking out of the box, out of the bubble? The bubble is all this hatred that was generated and is generated in the propaganda, in the media all the time. It produces more money for the media, by all means. But the point is that this is not helping anybody. It just keeps recurring. We have to understand there were almost 1,400 people killed in 2008 and 9. And this keeps going and happening. All these discussions and all this Good Samaritan wills to help don't get the help that is necessary. So what David Grossman is suggesting to keep outside the box means, I think, in a few steps. Number one, to really try to look a new way of thinking, how can we do something about what is happening? Really to take a new step. And this has not happened yet. Unfortunately, it did not happen in Urbana, in the United States. The only thing that I think that we have learned so far about the United States in the past days is that John Kerry goes to Jerusalem, tries to help again, and he's being kicked out. He's being basically blamed on doing something wrong. Whether this was wrong or right, that's not the point. The point is that the United States has been losing its clout all the time in the Middle East, in Syria, in Saudi Arabia, in Iraq, and in Egypt. In Egypt, El-Sisi told just a few days ago, for the first suggestion of Kerry, they told him, we Egyptians, we are not going to change the conditions of our ceasefire proposal. That is because they think that Kerry can't really help much. And as Carl pointed out, they did not say at any point that they want to stop the assistance that they are getting from the United States, the millions and billions of dollars that keeps coming there. On the contrary, they want more. They want more checks from John Kerry. They don't want his ideas. So we have to recognize that the clout and the hope that we are having here to influence our senators and Congress, to bring some changes in the world, that hope is becoming more and more inefficient. So out of the box would be a place where we can start thinking as people who are familiar with what is going on and willing to learn and to listen to what is happening, to start looking for new ways. For example, something that also was brought in the newspaper that David Grossman was writing in Israel, in Haaretz. So someone else is saying, how come we haven't yet looked for any way to discuss, to have some talks with Hamas? Hamas was out of the algorithm to begin with. Why? Why couldn't the Israelis find a way to talk with Hamas? There must be some loophole that would enable such talks or some negotiations, something that will be different from atrocities every recurring 1-2 years. There must be something in the Hamas, I think it's called charter. There must be something there that enables some talks so that they will be also involved in the negotiations, so that they will be also convened to where people are talking about peace, so that their voices will be heard, and then, of course, will be negotiations. One of the mistakes that was made just in the past days was the fact that all those talks were not done with Hamas. It was done with Egyptians, and Egyptians indeed have a lot involvement in this case. For example, there are those who are closing the other side of the entrance to Gaza. There are those who prevent entry to Gaza for merchandise that was paid for and for monies that were also supposed to arrive to Gaza. So the Egyptians are really involved in the whole thing. To find ways to talk to those people, indeed, this is going to be a very difficult talk. The people who invented the Iron Dome are people who are also maybe, at least maybe, to give it a chance, capable of finding a way to talk with Hamas and with the Palestinian Authority and find a way to stop these murderous atrocities going on all the time. Now, what I said to begin with, I would like to emphasize. This is not a voice, my voice here is not a voice that one hears usually in the AWARE talks. Not because they are trying to censor that. It's just because there's some inertia, I think, that was created throughout the years and the months, where people come here and put forth their opinions and their wills to change something. And I think that getting out of the bubble is not only a call to Israelis, and they do look now in Israel, some people in Israel do look now for getting out of this bubble, but also it's a call to us here in Urbana, trying to find new ways to address these issues. Thank you, Carl.
Thank you, Yaakov. This is very helpful and worthwhile. Comments, Ron?
Yeah, well, I don't think, and I've not talked to anyone who really thinks that Israelis, Zionists, and Jews are all the same people. Sometimes they're very different, but they do overlap to some extent. And I don't understand this objection that we need to think out of the box and think something different. That seems to me too vague and completely ineffectual to have any value, to me anyway. So my proposal is simply this, 3 words: stop the killing. But that will immediately be attacked, I suppose, and rejected as too simple. And if we could just do that as a immediate short-term project, stop the killing. But the only proposal now that is being made by the USA, in effect, indirectly perhaps, is to disarm Hamas. Well, Hamas would be crazy to accept that. They're calling on Hamas to commit suicide, essentially. And of course, Hamas will never do that. And as others have pointed out, you can't keep people bottled up in this prison for 8 years and expect some reaction to that. People don't realize the extent to which Gaza has become a huge concentration camp with only a few people and items allowed in and out. And eventually there would have to be an explosion with any group of people in there. And the explosion has finally come. And now people are moralizing about it and saying, oh, how horrible those Hamas terrorists are firing rockets and going through tunnels. Well, they're only doing what anyone in the circumstances would do, I think. And it shouldn't surprise anyone. But at the same time, people are pointing to the hundreds and now thousands of deaths among the Gazans and saying, well, it's their own fault. They brought it on themselves. They had it coming. And I reject that utterly, and I don't think we need to do any thinking outside the box about that at all, that the viciousness, the bloodthirstiness of this is evident to all, and we need to recognize the stark reality of that. That's all.
I think there's one way in which we should be thinking about the suggestion of getting outside the bubble, thinking outside the box. What we're dealing with here is what governments do. What is the government of the U.S. doing? What is the government of Israel doing? What indeed is the elected government in Gaza, which is settled into the Hamas party? What is it doing? That unfortunately has to be what we talk about, because they're the ones with the guns. They're the ones who are killing people. What governments do and why they do it is our subject and indeed our concern. The problem is that in each case, these governments need the support of communities, the American populace, the population of Israel, and indeed the population of the West Bank and Gaza, in order to accomplish what they set out to do, in order to accomplish their killing. The bubble that's constructed in order to keep these populaces in line is an extreme issue, and one I think Yaakov is talking about particularly, because it is a construction. It is propaganda. That's what needs to be broken through. An important recent book on the bubble as it exists in Israel, which Yaakov is right that we Americans don't have much knowledge of, is Max Blumenthal's book Goliath, that discusses the way in which the political actions of the Israeli government are sold to and constructed in the Israeli populace. We should turn our attention to that in this country, because the American populace is the most propagandized populace in the world. The United States discovered back about the time of the First World War that it really couldn't suppress opinion, and it was worried about doing that because of the large socialist movement in the United States at the beginning of the 20th century. The United States government decided that it could not control this with prisons, concentration camps, and police, although it worked hard to do it on many occasions through the First World War, through the Democratic administration of Woodrow Wilson. But it did decide that in order to control that population, the knout and the prison cell had to be replaced with the speech and the educational program. It had to be replaced, in other words, with propaganda. And the result is that Americans probably know less about what's going on in the rest of the world, much of which is a result of American government policy, than their victims do, than the people in the rest of the world do. Our first place is to begin to try to call things by their right names, to understand what the United States is doing, why it's doing it, and whose interests are being served. Let's take one particular example. The papers have been full all week while the massacre in Gaza has been going on, with statements about how John Kerry is trying to work out a ceasefire. Yaakov mentioned that Kerry was kicked out of Jerusalem when he came with a ceasefire proposal. That is indeed the way the American government presents it. We're trying to work out a ceasefire here, you know, and the locals just don't seem to want to play ball with it. This is absolutely false. The Obama administration could enforce a ceasefire. It could respond to Ron's request and stop the killing with a word, simply at a moment. And if you doubt it, look at the historical record. In 1956, long before Israel became the dependent client of the United States government that it is now, it had support from elsewhere. In 1956, it launched a military operation against the Suez Canal, which was nationalized by the government of Egypt. the American president, Dwight Eisenhower, who was not informed of it in advance pretty clearly, immediately ordered it to cease. And it did. Israel today, instructed by the American president to cease military operations in Gaza, would be forced to do so if Obama meant it. So these notions that we're trying to work out a ceasefire, but gee, these people just really won't take it, that's false, that's cover. That's typical Obama mendacity.
I doubt that very much, Carl. What would have been possible in 1956 is not necessarily possible today.
It's less possible. It was more possible. It's more possible today than it was in 1956.
Okay,
in 1956, Israel did not depend for the U.S. for military, diplomatic, political cover.
Okay.
It does now.
We may have to disagree about that. Let me quote here from this other article. As Kerry, Secretary of State Kerry, returned from the region over the weekend, Israeli media commentators leveled almost nonstop criticism of his attempts to bring Qatar and Turkey, two countries viewed by Israel as strong Hamas supporters, into the ceasefire negotiations. Kerry was also accused of abandoning some of Israel's key demands during the negotiations, including demilitarizing Gaza. In trying to implement the ceasefire over the weekend, they said U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry ruined everything, wrote columnist Ari Shavat in Monday's Haaretz, Israel's leading liberal newspaper. Very senior officials in Jerusalem described the proposal that Kerry put on the table as a strategic terrorist attack.
Yeah.
So what can you do in a case like that? We're not negotiating with Hamas essentially because Israel won't allow us to do so. And if we try to negotiate indirectly through Qatar and Turkey, the Israelis are raising hell about that too, because they're not sufficiently anti-Hamas. So it's a problem. Meanwhile, other high Israeli officials are, especially military figures, are referring to what's going on repeatedly in these wars every 2 or 3 years and killing thousands of Palestinians as mowing the grass. And it has to be done periodically.
You know what this reminds me of, Ron? The latter days of the Nixon administration. It's remarkable how often Obama is reminiscent of Richard Nixon and those dear departed days. What I'm thinking of specifically here is Nixon's assertion as the pressures upon him grew to liquidate the Vietnam War, pressures that included essentially a revolt of the American army in Vietnam. Nixon complained that he was in the position, the United States was being put in the position of a, quote, pitiful, helpless giant. Now, what we're getting, John Kerry isn't exactly a pitiful, helpless giant, because he's certainly not helpless. The American Secretary of State is a front man for the Obama administration, and his job is to appear to be what the U.S. claims it wants to be in the Middle East, that is, an honest broker working out those difficulties between contending parties, and ignoring the fact that it's precisely the United States' support for one of the contending parties that makes the contention possible. So the idea that poor John Kerry is being traduced and abandoned by the Israeli government seems to me to be quite false and to completely misrepresent the actual relationship between the American government and the Israeli government.
Then why are the Israeli commentators saying it?
What the Israeli commentators say is hardly to be taken as a representation of reality. They're not at all happy with the attempt of the American government to reduce the killing in Gaza. And the American government is not particularly happy that the killing goes on. We would like the Israelis not to inflame the local population against us, but that's the price of Israeli support, the Israeli government support for American operations in the region. Yaakov?
The commentators for the newspaper that Ron mentioned, Haaretz,
Yep.
include the diversity of opinions that definitely covers numerous pros and cons about what is going on, and they've been doing it for many, many years. And they've taken chances about it. As a matter of fact, Haaretz is considered to be very leftist and is being attacked. Just the other week, there was an interview with the current editor of Haaretz, who was essentially on TV. He was attacked for the positions that Haaretz dared take. But that's not really the point, I think, that needs to be emphasized as far as who's covering and how much is covering and who takes the marching orders for covering. I would like to speak a little bit about Hamas. I challenge Ron to tell me 5 names of leaders of Hamas. But if I were to challenge him to tell me 5 names of leaders from Israel, he will be able to come up with a list. Why is it that the Hamas people are not even known? Because they don't talk. It is Netanyahu who speaks for Hamas. There are always people speak about Hamas, but nobody speaks to them, doesn't give them a chance to speak for themselves and for their positions. Another challenge to Ron and to people who go that way is, have they read the Hamas charter to see what it says about Israel? It's very easy to read that and see why would people refuse to talk to them, on one hand. On the other hand, one can say, well, why don't we look also at the legislation in Israel that essentially discriminates against Palestinians, discriminates against Arab citizens, and do some understanding of what is going on. I think that all these generalizations that are being put on Israelis and all those thousands and hundreds that become millions, and all that thing doesn't really help the issue at all. It just bubbles more and more the hatred.
May I just say that the reason I recommended Max Blumenthal's book is that he tries to put a name and face on exactly those things that are going on the ground, as you suggest. Ron, we have just a minute or two for a response to Yaakov, if you'd like.
No, this is so incoherent that I don't know what to say. What would be the point? The strength of the Hamas movement is that they don't have any designated leaders to be accused and vilified, and so that's a point perhaps in their favor. But so no one is making official pronouncements in their name, and if you looked at the American Declaration of Independence and Constitution too, you would be surprised at the deviations between what's actually happening. So you may view these founding documents as extremely important, and in a way, of course, they are, but it may have very little to do with present-day realities of what's going on there and who is killing whom.
Thank you, Ron. You have been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 31st week of 2014. It's what the White House aides call Terror Tuesday today, the day each week when President Obama picks out some people to be murdered by drones or U.S. death squads, the U.S. Special Operations Command. The source for this is an article that the U.S. government placed in the New York Times over a year ago. The president's underlings, notably CIA Director John Brennan, compile a list of who should be executed, and the president then chooses from baseball cards that are presented to him who will die. The assassinations are carried out in secrecy. The administration doesn't release accounts of the people they kill. We find out about them only when people on the ground tell us what has happened, as in northwest Pakistan last month. Literally thousands of men, women, and children have been killed by Obama's order. Most Americans don't know that the U.S. is running this terrorist program. Our thanks to Jason Liggett and Joseph Cash for direction and production of Aware on the Air, thanks to whom also this program and others like it will be available on YouTube. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Ron Zote, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Johnson, Deb Johnson, and other members and friends of Aware, including Yakov tonight, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.